The wagon groaned up the red dust road, wheels rattling over stones as it climbed toward the mountain town of Silver Bend. July wind swept across the trail, dry enough to crack skin, carrying the scent of scorched earth and the weary hum of cicadas. On the back bench, Lila Dawson held her worn leather satchel tight, fingers laced so hard her knuckles whitened. 8 years had passed since she'd fled this place. She'd crossed towns where no one asked questions, taught children whose parents didn't know her name before St. Louis. But no place had ever made her heart pound like this. The old road beneath her was the same one she'd taken the night she left, empty-handed, through a storm of whispers and hate-filled eyes. The driver snapped his reins and called out, "Silver Bend ahead!" Just 3 words, and she froze. Lila drew in a deep breath, tucking her hand beneath her coat, feeling the rough weave of her blue dress. She'd chosen it because it looked proper, distant. She pulled her wide-brimmed hat low, letting only the dusty horizon stay in view. The town emerged beyond the bend, small, still, bathed in the thin gold light of the high country. The Silver Dollar Saloon still stood, its paint peeling, its porch sign creaking in the wind. Across the street, the old general store slumped under a striped awning, and farther up, the white church gleamed faintly like a scar that time refused to fade. When the wagon stopped before the post office, Lila felt her pulse thudding in her chest like hooves on hard ground. The driver turned to her, voice rough with dust. "Silver Bend, ma'am." She clutched her bag and stepped down. The earth was hot beneath her boots. Yellow dust rose in slow spirals, curling around her hem like smoke. She shouldn't have been trembling, but she was. Every plank, every window seemed to know her name. She turned quickly toward the Wilkins boarding house, where the school board's letter had promised her a room. They knew her only as Miss Lila Dawson, the new schoolteacher from St. Louis. None of them knew she'd once been Lila Rivers, daughter of the man accused of betraying 3 families in the Silver Bend bank robbery, the crime that left her a pariah and sent her running into the dark. A gust caught her hat brim. She lifted a hand to steady it, and froze at the sound of boots across the street. A tall figure paused in the sun. She recognized that stance before daring to look up. The squared shoulders, the glint of a silver badge catching the light. Sheriff Graham Thorne. For a heartbeat, time folded in on itself. 8 years dissolved into dust. Lila's breath caught. He looked different, broader now, skin burnished by the mountain sun, his eyes still the color of the northern woods. When he spoke, his voice was steady and low, like gravel rolling in a riverbed. "Excuse me, ma'am. You dropped this." He bent to pick up her handkerchief. The old one. The one with a purple daisy embroidered by her mother's hand. He offered it to her. Her fingers brushed his, a fleeting touch, sharp as a spark. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice too calm for the storm in her chest. He tilted his head, studying her. "Do I know you?" Lila raised her face. The hat no longer hid her eyes. Black met gray, 2 memories colliding under the noon light. The years fell away, the riverbank afternoons, his laughter, his hand gripping hers beneath the willow tree. She drew a quiet breath. "I don't believe so, sir. I'm the new schoolteacher." Silence hung between them. Then, instead of suspicion, instead of accusation, his mouth curved into something gentler. A smile. Not the kind that discovers a secret. The kind that's known it all along. "Welcome home, Miss Dawson," he said, voice low and warm as sun on pine. She couldn't answer. Behind her, the wagon rattled away, leaving her alone in the settling dust. And there she stood, heart pounding, eyes burning, realizing she hadn't just come back to a town. She had come back to the place where her heart had been buried. The Wilkins boarding house stood at the far end of Main Street, where the wind moved through the tall aspens like endless whispers. Its white-painted porch, lace-curtained windows, and faint scent of apple pie might have seemed comforting to anyone else. To Lila, it was only shelter. Mrs. Wilkins, a kind-faced woman with flour always dusting her hands, greeted her with a gentle smile. "Room upstairs, facing the garden. Supper's at 6 sharp, dear." "Thank you, ma'am," Lila said softly. Her room was simple, neat. An iron bed, a wooden desk, and a single window framing an old pine tree. She set down her bag, peeled off her gloves, and let her eyes wander the quiet space. Everything was so tidy it felt hollow. Outside, the church bell tolled, the sound long and solemn, as if to remind her she was truly home again. At supper, there were 4 at the table: Mrs. Wilkins, Mr. Daniels, a retired bank clerk, and Mrs. Parsons, the widowed milliner who owned the hat shop on Main. "You're from St. Louis, Miss Dawson?" Mrs. Parsons asked, her voice mild, though her smile carried a familiar curiosity. "Yes, I taught there for a few years. City life must be lively, not much excitement here." "Sometimes quiet feels like peace," Lila said, offering a polite smile. Mrs. Wilkins chuckled, but Mrs. Parsons's eyes stayed sharp. In Silver Bend, newcomer was just another word for suspect. Lila understood that, and she had come ready to endure it. The next morning, she walked to the small yellow schoolhouse at the end of Maple Street. 2 rooms, sun-faded walls, and children's laughter spilling into the yard. She swept dust from the floor, polished the desk, and arranged stacks of worn books along the shelf. The scent of chalk and paper pulled her back to girlhood, before everything turned to ash. By afternoon, she carried her papers to the town hall to register. The wind rose, catching the stack in her hands. Sheets scattered across the yard like white birds. She knelt to gather them, and a firm hand brushed her wrist. "Careful there, Miss Dawson." She looked up. Graham Thorne stood before her, sunlight striking the silver badge on his chest. His mouth curved slightly. He crouched, collecting the stray pages, then handed them over, the corner of one brushing her sleeve. "I think this town owes you a proper welcome," he said, voice low and even. "Welcome to Silver Bend." "Thank you, Sheriff. There's a community meeting tonight. You'll want to come. They'll introduce the new teacher." "I'll be there." Brief words, but when his fingers grazed her wrist again, her pulse stumbled. He withdrew slowly, eyes steady, not curious, just aware. That evening, the small church was packed. The townsfolk gathered to hear about the harvest and the repair of the Western Bridge. When Lila entered, conversation dimmed. Heads turned. A few murmurs fluttered through the crowd. Then silence. She, who sat in the back row, spine straight, eyes fixed on the pulpit where Graham spoke beside the mayor. Under the oil lamps, the sheriff's badge gleamed against his sun-browned skin. His voice carried, quiet but firm, the kind that made people listen. When the mayor cleared his throat to announce the newcomer, he said, "We're fortunate to have Miss Dawson from St. Louis join us to teach our children." Lila rose and nodded politely. A few smiled, Others merely dipped their chins, weighing, measuring. Mrs. Parsons whispered to her neighbor, and a few faces turned. In the glow of lamplight and body heat, Lila still felt cold down her spine. Then Graham stood. "If I may," he said evenly, "Miss Dawson taught for years in the city. She's qualified and dedicated. Silver Bend's children couldn't ask for a better teacher." The room softened. A few murmured assent. Some nodded. No one argued. Lila's cheeks burned. She didn't dare meet his gaze, but she could feel it. Warm, constant, steady. When the meeting ended, she gathered her things and stepped onto the porch. The wind had turned cool, teasing the hem of her dress. Graham followed, keeping just close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "Thank you for what you said," she murmured. "No thanks needed," he replied. "I only spoke the truth. In this town, truth isn't always spoken." He met her eyes. "Maybe, but someone has to start." The air between them stilled. Smoke from a nearby chimney drifted past, carrying the scent of pine sap and firewood. She turned to leave, clutching her ledger. Behind her, his voice came quiet, almost to himself. "8 years didn't change your eyes, Lila." Her step faltered. She didn't turn. She only walked faster into the wind, holding her breath as if to keep her heart from breaking open again. That afternoon, Silver Bend shimmered beneath the pale gold light of late summer. The schoolhouse had been swept clean, desks lined in neat rows, and a small bouquet of wildflowers sat on the lectern, a quiet gift from Mrs. Wilkins. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew what the gathering was for, to see whether the new teacher from St. Louis was respectable enough to be trusted with their children. Behind the classroom door, Lila Dawson stood still, hands cold despite the heat. The murmur outside was a steady hum. Men's coarse laughter, women's whispers, chairs scraping across the wooden floor. Every sound pressed against her chest, like a wall she had to cross. When Mayor Thornton clapped for attention, she stepped forward. Sunlight slanted through the back window, glinting on her dark hair and casting a warm sheen across her skin, the same bronze tone that had once marked her as different in the eyes of this town. "Let's welcome Miss Lila Dawson," the mayor announced, his cheer louder than it needed to be. "She's come all the way from St. Louis, well-trained and ready to start teaching next week." Scattered applause followed, polite, uncertain. A few faces smiled, most simply watched, as though one wrong word might reveal whether she was someone to embrace or to reject. Lila opened her small notebook, her voice soft but steady. "I'm grateful for the chance to stand here today. I believe every child, no matter their name or where they come from, deserves to learn and to be seen through fair eyes." She paused, then added, her tone quiet but firm, "Silver Bend has always had a strong heart. I hope to help the children find a little faith in knowledge and in themselves." Silence lingered. Then came a few more claps, this time gentler, genuine. When she lifted her gaze, it found the doorway at the back. Sheriff Graham Thorne stood there, hat in hand, sunlight resting on his shoulder. He didn't smile. He only nodded once. Simple, steady, and somehow it loosened the breath caught in her chest. The meeting ended soon after. Voices rose again, friendly enough now. "Welcome to Silver Bend," they said, as they filed out, some meaning it, some not. When the door finally closed, and the room fell quiet. Lila began gathering her papers. Then came the slow, measured sound of boots on the floor. "That was a fine speech," Graham said. His voice filled the space, deep, unhurried. "I saw a few folks nodding for real." Lila turned, keeping her calm. "Thank you, Sheriff. I only spoke what I believe." "And you've believed it a long time, haven't you?" The question wasn't sharp. It was a quiet arrow, straight and true. She smiled faintly. "People change in 8 years, Sheriff." "Some things don't," he replied, taking a few steps closer. "I knew you the moment you stepped off that wagon. The way you held your shoulders, the way your eyes searched the street, like you were trying to find your way home, not just arrive." Lila said nothing. The sun had dipped lower, filling the room with honey-colored light. Dust motes floated like ghosts of memory, drifting between them. "You changed your name," he said softly, "but not your eyes." Her breath caught. "You're mistaken, Sheriff. I'm just a teacher from St. Louis." He smiled, not in amusement, but in quiet understanding. The last of the sunlight carved his features in gold and shadow. The weathered jaw, the small scar at his chin, the gaze that had never once turned cruel. "You have her eyes," he murmured. She couldn't answer. The past crashed in. The pounding of hooves, whispered promises by the riverbank, his voice the night she left. "No matter where you go, I'll find you." And now he had. Outside, the church bell began to toll, calling the town to supper. Their shadows stretched long across the wooden floor, two figures caught between what was and what could never quite be undone. When he turned to leave, his parting words came low and calm. "See you around, Miss Dawson." She stood still long after he was gone, one hand pressed against her chest, as if to quiet the heart that had just remembered how to beat again beneath a borrowed name. The road leading out of Silver Bend shimmered with gold dust and wild grass. Afternoon light fell in slanted lines through the tall pines, stitching the path with threads of sunlight like scars slowly mended by time. Graham Thorne rode beside Lila, his hat casting a half-shadow over his sunburned face. She hadn't wanted to come, but he'd said it in that calm, steady voice of his, the kind that left no room for refusal. "There's something I want you to see, Miss Dawson. Won't take long." Now, as the trail curved upward, she saw where he'd brought her, a small white house, roof slanting beneath the pines, its fence old but standing, her father's house, the same house she had last seen through tears on the night she fled. Lila stopped in her tracks. "Sheriff, why here?" Graham drew his horse to a halt and turned to face her. The sun glinted off the badge pinned to his chest. "Folks said this place was cursed. No one would buy it after what happened," he said quietly. "But I don't believe in cursed houses, only places that need a bit more light." He dismounted and pushed open the gate. The hinges groaned. The air smelled of resin and old wood. The yard was overgrown, but the porch was swept clean, as if someone still cared for it. Lila followed, each step pressing deeper into memory. The porch where her mother once sat sewing, the window where she hung her little bird cage, the blackened mark on the post, where her father dropped a lantern and nearly burned it all down. Every detail was still there, only softened by dust and years. "You live here?" she asked. "4 years now," he said. "I fix what I can. When I've got the money, I replace a board, mend a hinge, paint a frame. The place holds together better than most people think." It sounded like a simple answer, but something in it caught at her throat. He opened the front door. Evening sunlight spilled through the windows, painting the walls in warm amber. The room was plain: a rough-hewn table, a few chairs, a vase of wildflowers. Nothing fancy, but nothing haunted either. "You've done a lot for this town," she said softly, just to fill the quiet. "Maybe I need to keep busy," he replied. "Helps me not to dwell." "On what?" "Things lost." She turned away, afraid he might see her eyes shine. Then he crossed to a wooden cabinet and took out a small box. "Found this when I was replacing the floor upstairs. Figured it might have belonged to whoever lived here before." He handed it to her. Inside lay a silver necklace with a turquoise stone, her mother's, the one she thought had been lost forever. "Oh," she breathed, barely a whisper. "You recognize it? It looks like something I once saw when I was little." It was a lie, and a thin one at that. Her voice trembled too much for pretense. He didn't question her. He only watched, eyes calm, steady, seeing far more than words could hide. "Strange thing," he murmured. "When I found it, I thought maybe someone would come back for it." She said nothing. Her fingertips brushed the stone, tracing its cool surface, and emotion rose sharp in her chest. Then he stepped closer, slowly, as if afraid to break the moment, and took the box from her trembling hands. Their fingers met, a light, fleeting touch that sent a pulse through her, fierce and wordless. They stood in stillness, the silence heavy between them. Outside, the shutters creaked softly, and the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. "You're not afraid?" she asked quietly, eyes still on the necklace. "People say this house is haunted." Graham smiled faintly. "People say plenty, Miss Daw." He stopped, caught himself, and started again. "Miss Dawson, I only know that every time I open the windows, sunlight still comes in. Light's never afraid of the past." She lifted her gaze. This time neither of them looked away. No words, no smile, just the stillness of two hearts remembering. When he finally closed the lid of the box, she saw that her hands were still shaking. "Keep it," he said. "Seems like it belongs with you." "No, you keep it. The house is yours now." They stood a moment longer. The room was full of light, and in that light something inside her stirred. Fragile, aching, and beautiful as an old scar touched by a gentle hand. At the door, she turned once more to the house and whispered, as if to herself, "Real light always finds its way home." Graham said nothing. He only watched her, the woman he'd once lost to fear and silence, until she disappeared down the golden road. Then he stayed where he was, beneath the old porch roof, a man holding the memory of everything he had never stopped waiting for. The day of the picnic came with the scent of cut grass and children's laughter drifting through the air. The sun was warm but not harsh, and the wind carried a softness that made Silver Bend seem kinder than usual. The road to Willow Creek curved through gentle hills, shaded by drooping willows whose branches brushed the water below. Lila carried a basket of bread and fruit, a few picture books tucked beneath a cloth. The children ran ahead, shoes crunching on gravel. Each sound of laughter made her chest loosen, as if they were teaching her how to live again in a place that had once broken her. Behind them rode Sheriff Graham Thorne, his horse keeping an easy pace, revolver at his hip, but his expression lighter than she'd ever seen it. When sunlight slipped through the leaves and caught his shoulder, she felt something in herself quiet, some long-held guard beginning to fall away. At the creek's edge, she chose a wide tree for shade, spread a blanket, and laid out bread, apples, and milk. The stream murmured nearby, and the wind through the willow branches made a song of its own, an old tune without words. "Miss Dawson! Miss Dawson!" Little Tommy Jenkins, all of 10, came running, his fist closed tight. "Look! I found gold!" He opened his hand. A small stone glittered in the light, bright as a promise. The other children crowded around. "Let's see," Graham said, crouching beside him. He turned the stone in his palm. "Could be pyrite, not real gold, but still something worth keeping." "Pyrite?" the boy echoed. "They call it fool's gold," Graham said with a faint smile. "But sometimes the things that only look real are the ones that give us hope, and hope's worth more than gold." The children went quiet for a moment, then scattered off again, laughing. Lila looked up at him. "You ever gone looking for gold yourself?" He shook his head, setting his hat aside as he sat next to her. "My father did. Said he'd buy back the land we lost if he struck it rich." "Lost?" she asked. He nodded. "After the bank robbery. He was accused of helping the gang. 6 months in jail, cleared too late. By then the farm was gone. He never held a gun again. Just a bottle. One night he met another drunk at the saloon." Graham paused, gaze fixed on the shining water. His voice roughened. A knife came out. That was the end of him. The wind stirred, rustling the willow branches. The water shimmered, full of light and sorrow. Lila's hand tightened around her skirt. Her voice came out barely above a breath. "My father, he was the reason your family lost everything." He didn't move. For a long time, the only sound was the creek. Then he said quietly, "I know." Her head snapped up, eyes wide. "I knew the first day," he went on, "not just because of your eyes. You forget, Lila. I was there that night. I remember the little girl crying in the street while they led her father away. You don't forget a sound like that." Her throat closed. "I should have left the moment you recognized me." "Gone where?" His tone was gentle, not accusing. "You've been running 8 years. How much longer would you keep going?" She said nothing. The sun slipped lower, and its light caught in her hair, turning it to the color of honeyed copper. He watched her a moment, then reached out, slowly, deliberately. His fingers brushed the back of her hand, warm and steady. No demand, no question, just presence. "We both lost something that day," he said, voice low. "You lost your youth. I lost my faith. But maybe we both survived." She looked down at their hands, her brown skin against his weathered tan, close enough to touch, yet separated by a breath. On the water, their reflections blurred into one shape. "You don't hate me?" she whispered. "Hate?" He gave a small, tired laugh. "I've spent too long trying to decide who to hate. Maybe the only person left to blame is myself, for believing one mistake could define a whole life." From across the creek came the shrill laughter of children. Tommy ran up again, holding out the same stone. "It's not real gold, Miss Dawson, but I'm keeping it anyway. It's pretty." "Keep it," she said softly. "Sometimes the most precious things are the ones no one else wants." When the boy ran off, Graham stood and extended his hand to her. She hesitated, then took it. This time the touch wasn't hesitant. It was steady, the kind that meant letting go, not holding on. For the first time in 8 years, it wasn't about guilt. It was forgiveness. Sunlight spilled across the creek, painting the ripples gold. The children's laughter echoed between the trees, and in that soft, fading hour, Lila's heart leaned, quietly, completely, toward the man she once thought she had lost forever. The rain had started before dusk, soft at first, then steady, the kind that blurred edges and hushed the world. Drops pattered against the schoolhouse roof as Lila Dawson locked the door, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Thunder rolled far off, and the sky pressed low and gray, heavy with what the night would bring. A wagon drew up by the gate. Graham Thorne stepped down, coat glistening with rain, hat brim dripping. "It'll get worse soon," he said in his even voice. "If you've nowhere to take supper, I'd be honored if you'd join me. Just a meal." "Just a meal?" she asked, eyes searching his face. "And a few old stories that need air," he said quietly. She hesitated, then nodded. They called his home the Rose House, named for the wild roses climbing the fence, their scent rising even in the rain. By the time the wagon reached the porch, the storm had thickened. Graham helped her down, his hand firm on her wrist, warm through the damp. Inside, a fire burned in the hearth. Light flickered along the log walls, turning the room amber and alive. Lila removed her hat. Wet curls clung to her neck. She moved closer to the fire, holding her palms toward the warmth, breathing in pine smoke and rain. "You like stew?" he asked from the kitchen doorway. "I'd forgotten its smell," she said softly. "Then tonight, you'll remember." They ate in quiet. Rain whispered against the windows, the clink of cutlery the only sound between them. But the silence was no longer sharp. It was full, like a pause in a song both already knew. When the plates were cleared, Graham returned with a small wooden box. Lila recognized it, the same box she'd seen before. But this time, when he opened it, there was no necklace inside. Only a stack of old letters, the paper yellowed, corners curled. "What are these?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "Letters," he said, with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "On nights I missed you, I wrote. I meant to send them, but there was nowhere left to send them." She touched the brittle pages. Ink blurred in places, as if smudged by time or weathered by a hand that hadn't wanted to let go. She unfolded one. "If you could see me today, you'd know Silver Bend isn't the same. It breathes easier now, but it's still missing something. You." Her breath caught. Tears welled and slipped down her cheeks without sound, falling onto her wrist, darkening the faded words. He moved to stand behind her, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "Lila," he murmured, his voice roughened by feeling. "I never knew where you went, but I never stopped talking to you. Those letters, they were the only way I knew how to keep you near." She turned, eyes shining through tears. "You don't hate me? After what my father did?" "Maybe I did once," he said quietly. "But how do you hate someone whose laughter you still remember? How do you curse the light that saved you once?" He brushed a tear from her cheek. His fingers lingered, warm against her skin, and the world seemed to still. When he leaned in, the kiss came softly, without haste. A breath, a prayer, a promise long delayed. Outside, rain struck harder. Inside, the firelight trembled. She let the letters fall to the table, placed her hand on his chest, feeling the sure, steady beat beneath. He held her, not tight, just enough for her to know she was safe. They didn't speak for the rest of the night. The storm raged, and they sat beside the fire, the glow tracing their faces. Later, she leaned against him, not out of weakness, but because for the first time in years, she could. The room glowed red gold. Rain, breath, heartbeat, all one rhythm. No rush, no regret, just the quiet certainty of two souls finding home again. By morning, mist hung thick over the hills. Lila woke in soft light, the air still carrying the scent of smoke and roses. From the kitchen came the low sound of Graham's humming and the smell of coffee. She watched him for a moment. Sleeves rolled, hair tousled, moving with a peace that came only from truth finally spoken. He looked up, caught her gaze, and smiled. The same smile she had carried in memory all those years, only gentler now. No words passed between them. None were needed. Outside, a single drop of rain slid from the roof and vanished into the earth. The wild roses by the fence opened wide to the morning, blooming red against the pale gray sky. Rumors in Silver Bend never needed a voice. The wind carried them well enough. After the rain, the town began to whisper. A blacksmith swore he'd seen Sheriff Thorne's coat hanging on the porch of the Rose House before dawn. The milkwoman said the new school teacher hadn't returned to the boarding house that night. The story traveled, through the saloon, through the general store, through kitchens thick with steam and gossip. Who is she, anyway? Some woman from nowhere turning the sheriff's head? Graham heard the words. He didn't answer. He didn't defend. He simply went about his day, riding down Main Street, checking the stables, speaking to the mayor. His calm unnerved people. It was too quiet, too steady. The quieter he stayed, the faster the rumors ran. Lila walked the same streets, head held but heart pounding. She wore her wide-brimmed hat and the calm of someone who refused to bow, though every whisper behind her felt like a stone against her back. At the school gate, some parents hesitated. One child turned at the door and waved, a small, simple motion that nearly undid her. That afternoon, Graham appeared at her desk with a bundle of white daisies. He set them down and said only, "Let them talk." "You don't understand," she whispered. "You're a man. You'll be forgiven. I won't." "You will," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "Truth doesn't need anyone to protect it." She looked at him, lips parted, but a gust of wind through the window stole her words. He reached out, his hand covering hers, steady, patient. "Come to church with me Sunday." "Graham." "Not to explain," he said, "just to stand beside me." Sunday dawned clear, as if the storm had been a dream. Church bells echoed over the roofs, rolling across the quiet streets. People filed toward the white chapel, hats straight, voices bright. But when Lila Dawson appeared, the chatter dimmed into murmurs. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her gray dress plain, her hat pulled low. Every step felt like walking into judgment. Eyes turned, not curious now, but measuring. And then Graham Thorne walked out from the crowd. No badge, no gun, only a white shirt, clean and simple. He moved through the people staring, straight toward her. "Morning, Miss Dawson," he said, loud enough for all to hear. She looked up. "Sheriff?" He extended his hand. The world seemed to still. The only sound was the flag snapping in the breeze above the church. Lila stared at that hand, sun-browned, calloused, strong, the same hand that had once steadied her, once held a gun in her defense, now offered her peace in plain sight. She hesitated. Fear flickered, pride too. But his eyes held hers, not pleading, not commanding, just waiting. She placed her hand in his. A breath rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered. Someone else sighed. But no one spoke loud enough to stop them. Graham's fingers closed around, hers, firm, certain. Without releasing her, he guided her up the church steps. Light poured through the stained glass windows, painting the two of them in color, blue, gold, crimson, until every whisper dissolved into nothing. "Let them talk," he said softly. "Truth needs no defense." She smiled faintly. "And what about me?" "You need prove nothing at all." Inside, the pastor paused, then smiled and nodded as they entered. They took a seat at the back pew. Through the entire service, Lila didn't glance around. She only felt his hand enclosing hers, an anchor, a vow without words. When the hymn ended, she dared a look at him. His expression was peaceful, not proud, not defiant, just free. When the service ended, they stepped outside. The sun had climbed high, melting the last threads of snow. Children ran laughing across the yard. A few townsfolk offered small, hesitant smiles, the beginning of something different. At the gate, Graham released her hand. "See?" he said quietly. "All it takes is walking side by side." She blinked back tears. "You made them look." He shook his head. "No, I made them see." A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of the rose garden by the fence. A few petals broke loose and spiraled around them, soft as a blessing. And for the first time in 8 years, Lila Dawson did not lower her head. Autumn came early to Silver Bend. The maples on the hills burned red like lanterns, and the wind carried the scent of apples and cut hay. The harvest festival that year drew more people than ever. After long months of scarcity and late storms, the town was ready to remember joy. Along Main Street, cloth banners fluttered in the breeze. Wooden tables sagged under the weight of pies, honey jars, and jars of plum jam made by the women of the town. Children ran past with flushed cheeks and sticky fingers, while the men threw horseshoes, laughing when one rang true. Lila Dawson stood near the bandstand, where the musicians were tuning their instruments. She wore a simple olive green dress, her hair swept up except for a few soft curls that fell against her neck. Each time she turned, someone smiled, nodded, or waved, gestures that only months ago would have been unthinkable. "Miss Dawson," Mrs. Wilkins called, pressing a warm apple tart into her hand. "A little extra sugar for days that need sweetness." Lila smiled. "Thank you." "No, dear," the older woman said softly. "Thank you for staying." Lila turned away just as Graham Thorne emerged from the far end of the square. He wore a black vest, his silver badge catching the light. His face was calm, but his eyes, steady and bright, carried the same warmth they had the day she returned. The fiddle struck its first note, and the waltz began. Couples moved onto the square, swirling skirts and boots tapping in rhythm. Graham walked straight toward her, his steps unhurried, certain. "You owe me a dance," he said, voice low but teasing. "Remember?" She laughed and placed her hand in his. The world narrowed to music and the press of his palm. Around them, people clapped in time, the air full of violin strings and laughter. Lila lifted her eyes to his, eyes that held no shadow now, only light, and for a moment, the rest of Silver Bend faded away. When the song ended, Graham didn't let go. He turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying across the square. "Silver Bend's been through its share of storms," he said. "But we've learned something worth more than gold. How to forgive, how to trust again. And today, I'd like to do what I should have done 8 years ago." The laughter faded into quiet. Flags rippled in the breeze. Even the horses seemed to still. Graham faced her and drew a small box from his vest. Inside lay a simple silver ring set with a pale pearl. "This pearl," he said, "was formed from a wound inside a shell. Pain made it, but it turned to beauty, like you, Lila, formed by hardship, yet shining all the same." No one breathed. Lila pressed her fingers to her lips, tears brightening her eyes. "Graham." He went down on one knee, right there in the dust of the harvest square, surrounded by everyone who had once doubted them. "I'm not asking for pity," he said, voice steady. "I'm asking for the chance to stand beside the woman who taught me to believe in goodness again. Lila Dawson, will you marry me?" The air held still, warm and trembling. She looked at the man before her, the one who had lost everything and yet carried tenderness like a flame, the one who had forgiven her, and in doing so, given her back herself. "Yes," she whispered. Then again, stronger. "Yes, I will." He rose, slipping the ring onto her finger. Applause burst like thunder. The band struck up a joyful reel. Children shouted. Mrs. Wilkins wiped her eyes, and the blacksmith roared, "About time, Sheriff!" Lila turned slowly, seeing faces once closed now bright with genuine smiles. Hands reached out, to shake Graham's, to press flowers and jars of jam into hers. What had begun as rumor had become blessing. Graham took her hand, leaned close and murmured over the music, "Let them keep talking. Only this time they'll speak kindness." Lila laughed softly, resting her head against his shoulder as the sun poured gold over the square. That autumn, Silver Bend harvested more than crops. It gathered forgiveness and the kind of love that blooms after the longest storm. Snow had fallen since dawn, not heavy, just enough to blanket Silver Bend in white, softening its edges until the whole town looked like a dream waiting to wake. On the hill beyond Main Street, the small white chapel gleamed through the mist, its windows glowing gold against the pale sky. Inside, garlands of pine and dried wildflowers curled around the wooden pews. The air smelled of resin and candle wax. The organ played low and trembling, its notes fluttering like breath in the cold. Lila Dawson stood behind the door, her veil as light as mist, her gown simple satin, an old curtain reborn by Mrs. Wilkins' careful hands, edged with silver thread. In the dim light, her brown skin glowed with a soft bronze warmth, blending with the white around her like the final brushstroke of a balanced painting. "Are you ready, child?" the Reverend asked, voice steady as a hearth fire in the cold. She nodded. The door opened. A gust of wind swept in, scattering snowflakes through the aisle. Everyone rose. At the altar, Graham Thorne turned. Their eyes met, and the world fell silent. Lila walked forward, each step a piece of her past gently laid to rest. The faces that once turned away now smiled through tears. Frances Miller, who had once lost everything to her father's crime, tipped his hat in quiet grace. The blacksmith pressed a rough hand to his chest and bowed his head. And before her stood Graham, the man who had taught her that forgiveness was not forgetting, but daring to love while remembering. When she reached him, the Reverend opened his Bible. "Love redeems what time cannot erase," he read, his voice deep and even. "Tin yu ku roi, nyung zi to yan kong the soignoi." Lila trembled. Graham reached for her hand, his fingers closing around hers, steady and sure. Their vows were plain. He promised to shelter her, through storm or sun. She promised to trust him, through change and season. No grander words were needed. The Reverend smiled and nodded. "By the grace of God, and in the witness of this town," he declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Graham lifted her veil. Sunlight poured through the high windows, spilling over her face, over the warm tone of her skin and the shimmer of her tears. In that light, there were no colors left to divide them, only radiance. Lila smiled, a small, trembling smile, and the whole chapel seemed to glow. Graham leaned down and kissed her, gently, reverently. Applause rose like the first thaw of spring, followed by laughter and the peal of church bells rolling through the cold sky. Outside, snow still fell, but the light was no longer cold. Children threw handfuls of snow into the air. Neighbors shook hands. Mrs. Wilkins wept openly, then gathered Lila into her arms. "You," she said through tears, "are the best thing that's ever happened to Silver Bend." Graham took Lila's hand as they stepped out onto the church steps. The street below shimmered with lantern light. Townsfolk cheered, tossing petals and grain. Someone struck up a bright waltz on an old fiddle. "I once thought my life would be nothing but laws and loneliness," Graham said softly beside her. "And I once thought I'd never hear my name spoken in daylight," she replied. He smiled. "Now the whole town is saying it." She looked down at the silver ring on her hand, the small pearl gleaming in its center, catching the firelight from the torches below. "Formed by hardship," she whispered. "Like you," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. They walked away hand in hand as the bells rang behind them, snow falling like quiet blessings on the road that led home, to the house on the hill where the rose light waited, and where love at last had a name. The house on the hill, once called the trader's house, no longer carried that name. Each morning, smoke rose from its new brick chimney, drifting low over the frosted meadow before vanishing into the pale sky. That house now belonged to Graham and Lila Thorne, a man who had lived by the law, and a woman who had once lived in its shadow. After the wedding, they didn't return in a carriage of flowers or to music and applause. They simply walked home, hand in hand, listening to the crunch of snow beneath their boots. Graham hung his sheriff's coat by the door. Lila placed her bridal bouquet into a clay vase on the table, the air filled with the mingled scents of hot tea, baked bread, and burning pine, the fragrance of belonging. Their first days together moved slowly, as if both were learning how to breathe in rhythm again. Mornings began quietly. She rose first, rekindled the fire, warmed the kettle. When he appeared, hair still damp, shirt half-buttoned, she had already poured his tea. "You still take it bitter?" she asked. "A little bitterness reminds me I can still feel," he said, and smiled. At noon she came home from the schoolhouse. her skirt dusted with chalk and stories from the children. He would be waiting on the porch, hat in hand, ready to take her basket. "The little ones wear you out?" he teased. "They're louder than any storm," she laughed. "But I think I need the noise." As evening fell, Graham read by the fire while she mended his shirts. She loved to watch him in those moments. Broad-shouldered yet gentle, his back straight, his face softened by lamplight. Sometimes he'd glance up, catch her staring, and smile without a word. The silver of his badge reflected the flame, flickering like a promise rather than a burden. Dinner was always simple. Stew, bread, or soup, quiet meals filled with fragments of conversation. Town news, weather, the blacksmith's horse escaping again. And somewhere in the small talk, Lila understood what love truly was. Not the vows spoken once, but the steady choosing every day. One windy night, she sat at the table with pen in hand, her fingers trembling slightly. On the page she wrote, "I came back to face the ghosts. He taught me how to live with them." She paused, eyes lifting toward Graham by the hearth, sharpening his knife. He looked up as if he'd heard her thoughts. "Writing again?" he asked. "Just a few lines. For myself." "Don't let the past speak louder than now." She smiled. "It isn't. It's being rewritten." Spring arrived quietly in Silver Bend. Snow melted slow, revealing dark earth and shy green shoots. Lila planted flowers along the porch. Graham built a swing beside them. In the evenings they sat there, rocking gently as the wind moved through the grass, speaking of everything and nothing at all. One afternoon she helped her students plant saplings behind the schoolhouse. Graham rode up, pausing to watch from afar, hat tilted low. When class ended, a small girl tugged Lila's sleeve. "Miss Dawson, is the sheriff really your husband?" Lila blushed and nodded. "I knew it," the child whispered, grinning. "He looks at you different." That night she told Graham, and he laughed. "Smart kid." "And you," she teased, "you hide nothing well." He turned serious, his voice low. "You saw me when there was nothing left to hide." Life settled into the kind of peace they'd both believed they'd never have. The townsfolk who once crossed the street now invited her to supper, asked her to teach their children. Graham still wore the badge by day, but each evening he hung it on the wooden peg by the door, a quiet reminder that mercy begins at home. On the last night of spring, they sat by the window, moonlight spilling across the table. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "No," he said, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. "People say love redeems. But you didn't save me, Lila. You taught me how to live." She smiled, pen moving across her journal for the final line. "Love does not erase the past. It simply lights the path forward." And in the hush that followed, their little house on the hill glowed warm against the night, a beacon of quiet forgiveness, steady and whole. Summer came early that year. Across the rolling hills of Silver Bend, wildflowers bloomed in waves, gold, white, and violet, shimmering under sunlight that seemed to linger longer than usual. The breeze from the creek carried the scent of warm earth and grass, drifting through the open window of the house on the hill, where Lila Thorne stood with one hand resting gently on her belly. She had known for weeks, but that morning, as light touched the lace curtain, she finally let herself believe it. Inside her, there was another heartbeat, small, fragile, and very real. Graham came home earlier than usual, his hat dusted with road dirt, his coat streaked with dried mud. He set his revolver on the shelf and called out, "Lila, where are you?" "In the kitchen," she answered, voice barely above a whisper. He stepped inside, words ready on his lips, but stopped when she turned. Her eyes were bright with something he'd never seen before. "Graham," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He tilted his head, the familiar smile tugging at his mouth. "I think I already know." "Oh?" she asked, a hint of laughter trembling in her voice. "That look," he said. "My mother had it once, too." He stepped closer, hesitating for just a moment before resting his hand over hers on her belly. The gesture was slow, reverent, as if afraid the miracle might vanish if he touched it too hard. "Is it true?" he whispered. She nodded. "It is. Dr. Wilson confirmed it this morning. Everything's fine." He said nothing at first, just stood there, his blue eyes suddenly glimmering with light. Then he bent down, pressing his ear against her stomach. "I can't hear a thing," he murmured with a shaky smile. "But I know someone's in there, growing out of everything this town once thought was weakness." Lila's fingers brushed through his sun-browned hair. "Sometimes," she said softly, "I think Silver Bend was never cursed. It was just waiting to be rewritten." He looked up at her, his smile deepening. "Then you're the first chapter." She shook her head. "No, we are." After that day, the house seemed to breathe differently. Graham repaired his mother's old cradle, sanding and painting it pale oak. On the headboard, he carved a single line, "For the life that began in forgiveness." In the evenings, they sat on the porch swing beneath the soft hum of crickets. The moonlight painted her hands silver as she rested them on her growing belly. "Are you scared?" he asked one night. "Of course," she admitted, smiling faintly. "Scared of the pain, of the loss, of repeating the mistakes my parents made." "And then?" "Then I remember," she said, "that I don't live in that story anymore." He tightened his grip around her fingers. "You'll be the best mother this town's ever known." She leaned against him. "And you?" "Me?" His voice grew, tender. "I'll be the kind of father who knows when silence is enough and listens when no one else will." She chuckled softly. "You've already started." When her belly grew round, everyone in Silver Bend knew. But this time, there were no whispers, no judgment. Mrs. Wilkins brought steaming soup every afternoon. Frances Miller sent over a hand-knit blanket. Her students arrived with wild daisies for the baby and for you. The town that once feared her name now moved with quiet excitement. As if in the small life she carried, everyone saw the proof that good things could still grow from broken ground. One evening, as Graham mended the fence, she called him from the porch. The sunset gilded her hair and turned her skin to honey. "Who do you think the baby will look like?" she asked. He wiped his brow, grinning. "I hope like you. The world could use more light. Maybe it'll have your eyes, steady, unafraid. Or your heart," he said softly, "the kind that forgives even when it shouldn't have to." She smiled, brushing her fingers over her belly. "If it's a girl, I want to name her Hope." He looked up, the name unfolding across his face like sunrise. "Hope Thorne," he said slowly. "Sounds like a prayer someone managed to hold on to." That night, Lila wrote by lamplight, her shadow swaying gently on the wall. "There was a time when my name meant shame, Now it means beginning. Maybe redemption isn't about erasing what came before, but giving it a child, so it can grow into something good. She set her pen down and gazed out the window. Graham was still outside, checking the locks, his frame bathed in moonlight. Her hand moved again to her belly, a small smile curving her lips. Outside, Silver Bend slept beneath a soft blanket of peace. The chapel lamps flickered faintly in the distance. No one spoke of curses anymore. There was only one story now, quietly growing, heartbeat by heartbeat, inside the woman who had once been cast aside and now carried the town's future beneath her heart. 10 years had passed since the winter wedding, and Silver Bend was no longer a town of whispers. It had learned to laugh again, to forgive, to rebuild what had once been broken. The house on the hill still stood, its timber darkened by sun and rain, but the porch was now wrapped in blooming roses. Each petal glowed gold in the fading light. From the backyard, the whole town stretched below in the glow of evening. The white steeple, the blacksmith's forge, the little schoolhouse, and the winding red road curling through the valley like a ribbon. On the grass near the creek, Hope, now 9 years old, chased her twin brothers, their laughter rippling across the water. Each sound of it mended something old, something the town had once tried to bury. Lila Thorne sat on the porch swing, the worn journal open in her lap. Her hair was threaded with silver now, but her eyes still carried the same light that once faced down a whole town. She watched her children, then lifted her gaze toward the small church on the opposite hill, where the evening bell tolled steady and low, the heartbeat of Silver Bend. Behind her, the door creaked open. Graham stepped out, carrying 2 cups of tea. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, his hair dusted gray at the temples. His stride was slower these days, but the calm in his face had only deepened. "They're soaked again," he said, half laughing. "Let them be," she replied, taking her cup. "We spent too many years afraid. They deserve to know freedom." He sat beside her. A comfortable silence settled, broken only by the hum of crickets and the soft clink of wind against the porch rail. Graham glanced toward the church, where the new reverend was teaching a small choir of children. "Do you remember," he said quietly, "when folks here were too afraid to even look at us walking side by side?" Lila smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "I do. And I remember you saying, 'Let them talk.'" He chuckled. "Never thought I'd see the day they'd ask you to teach their children to read." "That's the grace of time," she said. "It doesn't erase anything. It just teaches people to see differently." Hope came running up the hill, hair damp, cheeks flushed pink. "Mama, Papa, I found a heart-shaped stone." Graham knelt to inspect it, turning it in his calloused palm. "Looks just like the one Tommy gave your mother, long ago by this same creek." Lila laughed softly, a flicker of memory crossing her face, the shimmer of sunlight, a boy's laughter. The moment forgiveness first took root. When the children darted off again, Graham leaned back, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Would you do it all again?" he asked, voice low and even. Lila turned the silver ring on her finger, its pearl now worn smooth by years of living. She looked at him, her smile quiet, her eyes full. "Every minute," she said. "Even the hardest ones. Because without them, I wouldn't be here, wouldn't see them laugh, wouldn't see Silver Bend become what it is." He took her hand, rough against soft, a perfect fit shaped by time. "I used to think I saved you," he said, his tone almost a whisper. But you saved me, Leela. You made me believe goodness doesn't need to win. It just needs to endure. She rested her head on his shoulder, and together they watched the sun dip lower behind the ridge, spilling honeyed light across the roses, across the creek, across their joined hands. The church bell rang one last time for the day, long, low, and peaceful. They rose together and walked to the edge of the hill. The wind came up gentle, brushing against them like an old friend. Below, the town shimmered in the orange light of dusk. Hope and the boys ran in wide circles, their laughter echoing through the valley. "Look at them," Lila whispered. "That's what forgiveness becomes when you give it time. Laughter." Graham smiled, squeezing her hand. "And love," he said. They stood until the sun disappeared completely, until the sky turned a deep violet and the first stars woke above the valley. Everything Silver Bend had once been, the fear, the loss, the prejudice, melted into the twilight, leaving behind only this: the quiet glow of two people who had chosen each other again and again, and the light of a town that finally learned to do the same.